Did you know that the ancient Greeks had sheet music?
Stone, pottery, and papyrus examples of poems where some words have a letter above them have been found. Current thinking is that each letter stands for a different pitch, like the notes on the piano, but sharps and flats cannot be determined simply by looking at the music. The equivalent of which key it is in must first be determined. Figuring this out currently requires looking at all the letters in the song and using tables created by ancient writers and other means. Analysis shows that the distribution of notes used in the BCE and CE period were different. For example, the letter pi is used a lot in BCE music and not at all in CE music.
So, how are you going to use the same tables to decide what's sharp and what's flat for BCE music as well as CE music? In fact, how can you use the same system to assign pitches to letters for BCE and CE music if the letters they used in the two periods were a different set? I developed two tables to take care of this problem, and my method also helped to solve the sharps and flats dilemma.
The brilliant mathematician Archytas, circa 450 BCE, published tables of the tonoi by recording the lengths of string required to produce particular pitches. These were used to calculate ratios for the interval between each note. These can be converted into modern-day pitches by calling an octave 1200 cents and figuring out how many cents it is between each note in a tonoi. Here is the ancient Greek Dorian tonoi, starting arbitrarily on the western note D.
Using these measurements, Archytas published 5 of each type of tonoi in his tables. Dorian, for example, has 5 different columns, and in each row, some of the notes are slightly raised or lowered for some of the types of Dorian. Archytas also created 3 tables for something called genera numbers. These are called chromatic, diatonic, and enharmonic. I like to think of genera numbers as the musical accidentals. If you line them up on top of the letters in the alphabet, you can place the tonoi such that they will line up perfectly to some of these genera numbers. This is how I design my BCE table, lining the tonoi up where they fit the best to genera numbers, and also taking into account which tonoi were supposed to be higher in pitch and lower in pitch according to the literature.
Certain sharp and flat-sounding pitches happen naturally when Archytas ratios are used this way. This is because the notes are not evenly spaced. Some notes are very close together and some farther apart, so depending on which letter you start on, you get something that sounds a bit like a major or perhaps a minor scale. The biggest impact my tables have is probably on BCE music. Here is Orestes, music from a play by Euripides from the 3rd century BCE. You will notice that sometimes, such as in line 2, there is a letter and a big space after it. Scholars have decided that this note should be repeated as many beats as they feel that this letter should take. Also, I have chosen to interpret the Z-like letter embedded within the text as a percussion beat, when some scholars choose to interpret this actually as the pitch for the letter Z. You will hear my version, then the accepted version,
The main difference between my BCE table and my CE table for our ears is that the BCE table uses 11 symbols to represent an octave, whereas the CE table uses 22. Ancient writers did speak of 22 symbols being an octave in the CE period.
However, there are 11 unique pitches belonging to the set of genera numbers Archytas published.
It is interesting to note then that there are twice as many, or 22 symbols, in the CE table. This means that the notes are spread out more. Ptolemy published Archytas ratios in a publication on music 500 years after Archytas did. Ptolemy claims that these ratios are the most careful ratios available and that they actually reflect what musicians played during his day as well as what they were still playing 500 years later. This means that music from the BCE era should not have notes that are radically closer together than those of the CE era. It would be like using semitones in the Bach era, but whole notes and half notes in our era. However, when you look at the translation by Pullman and West, the first three notes are quite compressed.
They are less than the smallest distance between any two notes in any of the tonoi.
If you believe Ptolemy, the intervals between notes in songs should be similar in BCE and CE eras.